I'm hitting record now. Okay, I believe we are recording. So hi, everybody. Welcome to the February 8th meeting of the Multi-Tenancy Working Group. I am playing the part of Tasha today. I'm Adrian, and I'll be driving today. So as we've been discussing before we hit record, the agenda today is to talk about adding a section on multi-tenancy best practices and projects to the Kubernetes website. There is an issue open. It's 31479. And we've got a couple of people, Ranjith and Jeremy. I think you said you're both joining us from AWS.
That's right.
Yeah, cool. And so we can talk about what we will be putting into there. So Jim, I think you started this issue. Is that correct? Do you want to talk about the background of this issue?
Sure. Yeah, happy to do that. And yeah, Jeremy, thanks for reaching out. I know we had chatted over Slack and had kind of pointed you to the working group. So thanks for reaching out and following up on that.
Yeah.
Let me share. I think Adrian, you might have to give me permission to share somehow.
Try now.
Yeah. So, all right. Let me try. There we go. That works. Yeah, so the background behind this is, one of the things we were discussing, I think it was late 2021 is, so we had, within this working group, we've had a few projects that we built. Some of them have graduated and, kind of found newer homes within different SIGs. So the question was, what do we do next and where are we with multi-tenancy, right? And the general feeling was there's still a lot of interest. There's still a lot of questions around multi-tenancy, especially for new users to Kubernetes. And there's perhaps, although there's several tools now available, there's perhaps a lack of guidance in the official docs on multi-tenancy. So, that was the thinking that, how about we propose that we do add something in the documentation, and we had a few areas where we could potentially add this. I think either under concepts or architecture or how to extend Kubernetes, and provide at least for folks looking at multi-tenancy in or at least even, I guess the first thing would be to define what that even means, because what we've found is different teams have different or even different organizations have different definitions and uses of multi-tenancy, but at least trying to provide some general guidance. I think the last output, like documentation type output we've had as a group was the paper we published, and there have been a few blog posts in the past that I linked in here. So really this was just to kind of seed the idea and get feedback, and it seems like the docs team likes the idea. They've approved it for triage. So now the sort of ball is back in our court to start work on this, to propose an outline, fill in some sections, and decide what should be in the docs and what should not, right? So the process for docs is just like, I guess it's everything's driven through Git. We would do a proposal when we're ready. What we've found is that it's much easier to collaborate first in a Google Doc and get discussions and comments and feedback there. So if we draft up a Google Doc, we can then share that with other stakeholders like SIGAuth and SIG Security and others, get their feedback. And once we're ready, we can create a PR for the official docs itself.
And yeah, I think the idea here is we talk about some of the concepts that we've gone over, like what are the types of tenants, what are the types of isolation, because in our experience, and Ranjith and Jeremy, I'd like to hear what your experience is with this as well. In our experience, everybody comes to this question thinking, I just got a tenant and I need to know what the right thing is to do. And they don't really think about, well, there's a whole universe of possible types of tenants, and everybody who uses Kubernetes calls a different thing a tenant, and sometimes multiple things simultaneously. And there's lots of different types of isolation. There's no one right answer. And so we're trying to give some sort of guidance that is general enough, but also useful, rather than just like, oh, understand your use case and plan accordingly. So Yeah, I like the idea of starting a Google Doc. Sorry, I haven't done that myself. Like I've kind of wanted to, but I've got a bunch of other things going on, including HNC itself. So I'm the original author of HNC and the maintainer. So yeah, so maybe Jeremy, Ryan, do you want to tell us what your background is working with multi-tenancy and what you were hoping to, like, if you wanted to get involved in this way, like I'll contribute to a doc, like we all just pile on? What do you want to do?
Yeah, no, we're happy to contribute to a document. Personally, I've been working with Kubernetes for the last 4 or 5 years. First as a container specialist, helping folks adopt EKS, AWS's managed Kubernetes service, and helping them design for multi-tenancy where that was warranted. And also helping them determine whether they needed hard or soft multi-tenancy, or the extent to which they needed to isolate tenants. And oftentimes we would present them with a variety of different options. Ranjith could talk about his work with SaaS organizations, like ISVs who are developing SaaS solutions.
Cool.
I'm as a specialist and now as a developer advocate, I primarily work with customers who have multiple groups sharing a cluster. So they don't necessarily need the hard or harder multi-tenancy that a SaaS organization might. And so we've got a couple of different perspectives on the line, my own perspective and Ranjit's perspective from his work with SaaS.
It's funny, that's always been like the top level division that I found the most useful, is like tenants are dev teams versus tenants are SaaS customers. That's always been the first, because they're so different once you get past that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I work, first of all, I work at AWS in this team called the AWS SaaS Factory. So where, so where I work with customers or, ISVs that are building SaaS applications. And one of the, first things that comes up is, okay, how do we build good, efficient multi-tenant solutions, right? So especially the ones that are building on top of are using containerized workloads or have containerized workloads. They have Kubernetes, folks that know Kubernetes, right? So they come to us and ask us, okay, how do we build good multi-tenant solutions? And we, like Jeremy said, so we talk about this whole notion of hard multi-tenancy and soft multi-tenancy, right? So hard being you provision, isolated independent clusters, right, for your tenants. But at some point for these SaaS customers, it becomes highly cost prohibitive, right? So they cannot, like, let's say you scale and you have 1,000 tenants, right? So you don't want to be managing thousands of Kubernetes clusters. So, a year or so ago, or maybe a couple of years ago, we said, okay, let's build something around this whole notion of soft multi-tenancy and put something together. So I have built like example applications using, primarily AWS services, but I think it can, we could use open source solutions as well. And how do you use or take a single EKS or Kubernetes cluster and share that among multiple tenants, right? And when you do that, what are the different considerations that you have to make so that their workloads are isolated? There's no, like, one tenant shouldn't be able to access a different tenant's data or servers. A lot of considerations around those, like how do you use things like network policies, network plugins to secure their workloads when it gets to sharing a single cluster among multiple tenants. So I've been exposed to Kubernetes, just like Jeremy, for about 4 to 5 years now, and multi-tenancy is something that I've been focusing on for the past couple of years.
Cool, that sounds awesome. Because this is always, Jim has heard me go off about this a lot, about like getting the difference between SaaS multi-tenancy and team multi-tenancy, let's say, or DevOps multi-tenancy.
Yeah.
That sounds really cool. So in that case, I think is the next step, Jim, just to start the doc? And Laura, I think that you might have some input here as well. I think the next thing is to start the doc and start talking about what we want to do. And then maybe we iterate and figure out like where exactly it lives in the website. And like there's a chance it needs to be split up into multiple docs or something like that. But maybe just start a doc and say like, this is what we want to say, because we've said like bits of it in our blog posts over the past 2 years.
Yep. Yeah, no, that sounds like a good next step. So happy to, I can start a doc and, give out access to everybody in the working group. And that way, the first step would be if we draft up an outline and at least kind of have a general sense of what we want here. Now, some of the obvious things, like because this would be Kubernetes docs, I mean, here we focus mostly on Kubernetes concepts, what's allowed. I think there are, some CNCF guidelines on how to reference projects, both CNCF projects as well as third-party projects. We can add a section where people can, contribute that with some, disclaimers, etc., things like that. But the main goal here is to say, what can you do with Kubernetes? What's possible, what's not, and I think then give some guidelines to, again, based on like whether it's hard or soft or the type of clusters as a service or namespaces as a service, what are the other options available to extend or outside of Kubernetes, right? Yeah, so I can.
Because I don't think there's a ton of stuff for, like, there's quite a lot of stuff now for like the team multi-tenancy.
Yeah.
There's not a ton out there for SaaS multi-tenancy. There was a proposal in San Diego, I think, for something called Arc. And it's out there, it's open source. But I think I have a very hazy understanding of SaaS Factory. I did look into it once upon a time. I think that it's kind of like that, but there aren't a lot of options, and certainly nothing that I know of in the CNCF umbrella. Although, of course, you get one person using agency for that too. But yeah, so yeah, I think that it would be fine to sort of reference other projects, especially if it doesn't look like an endorsement. We could just say like, it would be great if we could get at least 2 examples for everything. Like Loft, we don't have any contributors from Loft here, I don't think, right now, but they certainly pop up from time to time, and I'd have no objection to like saying, hey, check out Loft, check the capsule, like by all means, go look, and these are the kinds of things people use.
Yeah, and we've done that with the EKS Best Practices Guide. We have a section on multi-tenancy in there, and we do reference solutions from third parties like Loft. It's not meant to be an endorsement. It's really meant to help customers who have requirements that can be met by those solutions, options.
Options, exactly.
Okay, sounds good. No, I think this will certainly be well received, and there's lots to talk about in this area. So, all right, I'll share an outline in the next couple of days.
Yeah, this is Fei. Andrew, so in the document, are we going to talk about the CRD level kind of details, or more than that, or higher than that? So,
what do you mean CRD? I think. Oh, sorry. Go on. What do you mean by that, Fei?
So for instance, in this document, are we going to describe particular CRDs? Because so we are not. So this is slightly different with other standard documents are talking about building APIs, right? So so everything built on top of the multi-tenancy most likely starts with some CRDs. So are we going to draw that path to describe the CRDs, or just a very high level saying we use CRD extension, so we are not going to describe how we design that CRD here?
I think I'd lean towards higher level. I'd lean towards like, how should you think about your tenants? How should you think about isolation? Okay, if you're in this category, go look at virtual clusters. Or if you're in this direction, go look at agency, go look at SaaS Factory, as like something like that. I think that's because the CRDs, like the actual API, I think is too low level, especially, Jim, I think we said this was going to go into the concepts area, right?
Right.
Of the website. Yeah, so I don't think you usually get into API details there.
Okay, that's fine. I just want to make sure. So then this determines the level, kind of what kind of levels of details we are going to describe.
I think this is like, I'm new here, what do I do?
Okay,
I think it's pretty high level to begin with.
that's fine. Okay, I try to make sure.
All right,
Cool.
that sounds good.
That's it. I don't know, does anything else on that topic? Otherwise, that's the only agenda item. We could have a quick update on from all the project leads to if anybody has anything they want to share. Anything else on this topic before we close it off? Or?
No, I'm excited to contribute.
Yeah, thanks for
Yeah.
joining.
Thank you. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. So let's go around the table. Faye, anything interesting that you wanted to talk about in virtual cluster land?
We most likely trying to reflect some of the code, adding more end-to-end test, and this is for virtual cluster. And for CapDN, we are trying to make sure we are going to have a release. I mean, set up the roadmap stuff. That's action items that we have for now. And we are not going to have any presentation for KubeCon EU, but maybe we are going to, we are thinking about something for KubeCon NA.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
What's the right way to refer to this project? Is it still virtual cluster or is it now CAPI something?
It's CapDN. It's the class API provider nested.
CAPIN. Okay, so we're not using the term virtual cluster anymore, or?
It's virtual cluster just very, you can call it as a very specific technology, but I mean, from the solution perspective, I would say CapDN. I'm not going to call virtual cluster as a solution. I'm going to call CapDN as a solution. But technology, you can call it virtual cluster. That has not conflict, in my opinion.
Okay.
Yeah.
That also helps to disambiguate with vCluster.
Right.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons I was asking, because for a while we had virtual cluster and vCluster, and they were very similar implementations of the same.
Yeah, so
like,
I would just call it a high level. I would call it technology. I'm not going to call it a solution. Anyway.
Okay. Cool. Jim, anything you wanted to cover?
Yeah, so not, so yeah, there hasn't been, too many updates. I know Mac, who's on the call, has submitted some cleanup and other enhancements for the benchmarks. I'm curious to know, how folks are using, if and how folks are using the benchmarks, what they would like to see. I think there's a couple of issues in the repo, but would like to get more feedback and we can, plan next steps accordingly. I think, yeah, there are, it functions as is. We had added even tests to do things across namespaces, etc. But I'm sure there's other, enhancements that can be done if folks are actively using these benchmarks. Does anyone have any thoughts, suggestions? Mac, anything to add to that, or?
Yeah, I guess the big one would be just fixing the tests. I have one new benchmark I want to add that I got to take for it, the blocking wildcard ingresses, and but without testing feels
right.
Yeah,
so the tests previously, we because this was sort of a mono repo across several projects, so we were not doing automated benchmark tests for every commit or things like that. But now that I think both HNC and virtual cluster or CapDN have moved out of this repo, perhaps we can revisit that and add in the benchmark tests to run on a PR.
Configuring all that stuff was a giant pain, but we documented how we did it on HNC. So hopefully you can just go to the bottom of the HNC repo and it's got like all the links to all of our configs, and that might help you out, including how to set up kind on the PR in the post-submit system. So you can do an end-to-end test on a kind cluster, which is really helpful.
Okay, can someone point me to the benchmark PR or repo? It's a very interesting idea. I'm not sure what kind of benchmark we will use to test multi-tenancy, like how separated they are, like how segregated are the requests from different teams. Is that the benchmark is about?
So if I got all of the question, it seemed like, sorry, the audio seemed to be breaking up somewhere in between, but you were asking if the benchmarks are static or can they be configured, or?
No, can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, now I can.
Oh, I'm just curious, in a high level, what is this benchmark testing of? How?
So I shared the link in chat, and so there's within the multi-tenancy Git repo, there's a section for the benchmark. So this has, I think when we were discussing this, we had come up with two levels of tests. And based on that, there's, a series of about 14 plus each one of these checks. The ones which are not linked are pending implementation. The other ones have been completed. So, and again, this is certainly open to discussion and refinement as we go along. But the whole idea was like you're suggesting, how can we audit multi-tenancy, or how can we even test? So given one or two namespaces, what would be the way to do that, right? So the easiest way to run these benchmarks is through, there's a command line tool, and you can kind of, go through this and either give a single namespace and it'll check for configurations, or there are ways to give multiple namespaces and it tells you what passes, what fails, etc.
Oh, cool. Okay, I'll definitely look into that.
Yeah, take a look and just reach out on Slack or through GitHub, if you have any questions, thoughts, feedback.
Cool.
Cool. And anything else, Jim, or should I go next?
No, that's it.
Okay, and in HNC land, so there's actually a fair amount of work going up, and we've also, I track the weekly downloads of the client. I don't bother to track the weekly downloads of the manifest for people to install things on their clusters, because I feel like people might just be reapplying the same manifest to the same cluster often. But we've hit a new record of something like, what's that, maybe 800 or so weekly downloads of the client. So lots of people are out there downloading the hierarchical namespace client so that they can work with them, which is cool. We got a new contributor from Norway Telecom, and we're basically continuing our, maybe march is the wrong term, but our amble towards 1.0. Like, people are using it in prod now, and so basically 0.9 was supposed to be the last pre 1.0 release. We basically decided to add basically two features. One of them is label propagation. So you could add a label to a namespace and have it propagated to all of the sub namespaces, ditto with annotations. And so that's mainly gone in. There's a couple of usability improvements that we could make, but I don't know if those are critical for 1.0. We might just call that feature beta in 1.0. And we are currently deciding whether or not to enable leader election before we go to 1.0 as well, because it's not a trivial thing to enable on HNC due to the slightly non-standard way that it works internally. And that's about it. So we've got some new contributors working on that kind of stuff. We're seeing good adoption. Red Hat just wrote an article about us, which is pretty cool. And so I'm hoping that we will be able to release 1.0. If we decide to get leader election I'm not gonna predict if it'll be in the next month. If we don't decide to do leader election, probably in about a month or so, we'll just declare 1.0, because we got Ricari using it, Norway Telecom looking at onboarding, at least one other that I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say, but they're all over Slack, so you can check them out. So at least one other large company that are using it. And so yeah, things are kind of plugging along well for HNC right now. Beyond that, I don't anticipate there being a lot of new features. HNC by design is supposed to be a pretty well-contained piece of machinery. And so while I certainly expect us to add features from time to time, the one that we keep on getting a request for is hierarchical quota. So we might add that one. But beyond that, I'm not anticipating a lot of new features. Really, these propagated labels and annotations were the last one that we got a lot of requests for beyond quota. So quota might come post 1.0, but up until then, I think that that we can release 1.0 without that. So that's the update for HNC. Any questions about that?
So Adrian, you were saying on quota, the plan would be to, after 1.0, to add some native support for managing quotas, or?
It's on the table. It's like we've got something for it in GKE, and we could use the same techniques. There's no magic to it. The fun bit of magic was basically discovering that we could hook into, rather than watching every possible resource that's monitored by quota, you can actually just monitor the quota object itself, because what happens is, to actually use some quota, Kubernetes, the API server, will actually try to modify the status of the quota object itself.
Okay.
And if that fails, it will actually block the submission of the object, whether it's a pod or a CRD or anything else. And so that's the trick that we use, is we just put a webhook on the quota object and blocked updates to the status if we didn't like it. So that means that there's only one type of object that you need to watch instead of all of them. So that's the trick that we use. And so I've always been open to somebody adding it to HNC using the same kind of techniques that we did. But I've decided, but I don't think anybody thinks that we need to hold up 1.0 for that. There's only, people ask about it a lot, but very few people have actually labeled it as a blocker to adopting it. Whereas we're getting more questions for things like, is it highly available? Is it approved for production, like with the current feature set? I think the answer to that is now yes. So I think we should go ahead and not wait for another major feature like that to go in, especially one which we have proven can actually be implemented in a separate controller. It doesn't need to be part of the core distribution.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, yeah, one other question I had, and I think we briefly talked about it previously, was with pod security admission coming around, right? With, I guess, which allows namespace-based pod security levels to be defined. Seems like there will be a greater push to having finer-grained namespaces, even for like a microservices style app, which becomes a natural fit for HNC, right? So I was wondering if there's been any discussion of that, or at least it would make a great demo or kind of blog post to show how the two features work together and complement each other.
Unfortunately, I've not looked into that, but it is a reasonable point. Maybe you and I can sync on Slack.
Okay.
Honestly, I wrapped my head around pod security policies, and now they're gone. I haven't really looked into the new one. My main job is as a software developer, not as a Kubernetes administrator, so I don't know that much about the replacement. But yeah, maybe we can sync later and talk about that.
Sounds good.
Sweet. Okay. Any last call, I guess, for any other subjects that we wanted to discuss today? Anything that anybody wanted to bring up? Going once, going twice. Okay, in that case, let's adjourn, and everybody enjoy your extra 20 minutes back for the day. Thanks for joining, everybody.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.